It doesn't try to pitch you this photoshopped, neat picture of humanity and the world, but is brutally honest and real. No, I don't think atheism responds better to suffering than theism does. However, what it does mean is that it is logically possible for God and evil to coexist at the same time.
If God exists, why is there so much evil in this world? Can we trust a God who allows suffering? These and other questions will be addressed in today's interview. I'm Andres Vasquez, and welcome to Imago Day. Our guest today is Alanzo Paul, who is part of the OCA team, the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. And he has a master's degree in theological studies from the University of Toronto. Hi, Alanzo, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Andreas, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, bro.
Yeah, I'm very excited about our conversation today, and I hope it would be the last time you can join me on the channel.
You invite, I'll come, bro. Every time.
As I mentioned at the beginning, in this interview, we'll talk about the problem of evil and suffering in the world. It's an important topic, not only intellectually, but also personally, and emotionally. But before we continue with the topic, maybe you can introduce yourself a little bit for those who don't know you.
Yeah. Well, again, thanks so much for having me. And hello, everybody that's listening or watching. Um, so a little bit about me. My name is Alanzo, and it's a Spanish name, but I'm not Spanish actually. So my mom's white, but my dad is from Guyana, which is actually on the continent of South America. So I feel like I'm in like good company right now with you, Andreas. Um, I was born and raised in Canada. My dad left Guyana as a refugee when he was a teenager. So him and my mom gave birth to me in Canada. And I grew up in a nominally Catholic home. So it wasn't serious about Jesus. It was more like, I'm going to go to church on Christmas and Easter, like just in case there is a God, because maybe he'll take it easier on us on Judgment Day if it turns out that he's real. So really, it's fire insurance, Andreas, more than anything else. And when my parents got divorced when I was 12, that's when we stopped going to church. And I basically became an agnostic. I didn't really know if there was a God. I wasn't too interested in God. I was sort of apathetic. I didn't care about the things of God. And then I became a drug addict as well. So I started partying and smoking and all those sorts of things at the age of 12 in order to kind of cope, to handle the things that I was going through, the trauma that I was going through. And then I became a full-blown opiates addict in my later teens, in my early 20s. So I was doing drugs like, I don't know, Oxycontin, Percocet, morphine, those sort of heroin related, opium related drugs. And so I was doing that from morning till night. And then I had an experience that really stirred me out of that, which was, it was after a night at the club. I went back to a friend's house, and this friend and I were doing lots of drugs that day, but he had a drug induced schizophrenic episode, which means he started hearing voices, and those voices told him to kill me. And so what he did was he took this blade and tried to decapitate me. He tried to cut my head off. And so he nearly succeeded too, eh? So he hit me in the back, but the blade hit the bone, that little bone in the back of your head. And then I woke up because, everybody would wake up if that happened to you. And then he swung again, he hit my hand, and I was able to escape and ended up in the hospital where I bled internally in my brain for 3 days. And so that was an experience that really woke me up to the fact that I'm probably not doing very well in life, and I probably am going down a destructive path. And so I'm a drug addict. I have this near-death experience. And then my sister is the one that starts going to church. and she changes Andreas. I can see. And so she invites my brother and I to go to church. And I was resistant for a long time because I felt like they would just judge me and make me feel guilty and ashamed. But that wasn't the case. When she actually convinced me to go, I was actually very warmly embraced. And then when I heard the gospel of Jesus properly unpacked, in an exegetical sort of way, I fell in love with this Jesus who loved people that have their lives in an absolute mess, just like me. And I thought to myself, if Jesus could love them, then maybe he could love me. And he did. And that's been my experience. So in 2009, it was a couple months after I got invited, I gave my life to Jesus and just have not looked back. Just absolutely loved being a follower of his, an apprentice of Jesus. So that's my story. There's more to it, but we'll keep it brief.
Wow, man, that really is a great testimony. I love hearing how God works in our life and he does it uniquely in each one. Now, I know you work and are part of the OCA team. Um, how did you get interest in apologetics and the things you have been doing?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So some people come, in my experience, some people come to Christianity through the intellectual route. So that means that they're probably agnostic, maybe they're an atheist, maybe they're a different worldview, and they have a set of questions that are obstacles between them and Jesus. And that's just how some people sort of are wired. I wasn't wired that way. So I was wired more as a feeler. And so my beginning to interact with Jesus and encounter Jesus was existential. I had this existential need that my life was a mess. My emotions were a mess. My body was a mess. My world was a mess. And I desperately needed a lifeline to hold on to. And Jesus was that lifeline that reached out in a very powerful way, in a very real way, that deeply resonated as true. And so that was how I came to know Jesus. Um, so yeah, some people come with the intellectual. I came with the emotional. It was after the emotional experience of experiencing Jesus and hearing his word that I became deeply curious. I was insatiable. I wanted to know what the Bible said. I felt like I needed to catch up with all the other Christians out there because I was 21 by the time I converted. So I'm 34 now. And I thought to myself, gosh, these folks have a 21-year, head start, and I got to make up ground. So I just devoured it. And I found that not only the word to be exceptionally interesting and powerful and life transforming, but I also found the intellectual side of Christianity really interesting. So the fact that there are things like, I don't know, arguments for the existence of God, and that there are people who study for their career the manuscripts of the Bible, or scientists like, let's say, John Lennox, who just love science and feel like science is an expression of their worship and devotion towards God. I found that deeply interesting. So that was really my introduction to apologetics, was just out of, I don't know, blind curiosity of just letting my curiosity be the driver. And eventually I came across this thing called apologetics, and I had no idea what that meant. I was like, oh, these people are just apologizing, eh? Yeah, let's see what they're apologizing about. And then I came across all these arguments and evidences and reasons for God. And I just loved it.
Now, moving on, let's jump right into the topic. First, I think it's important to always define terms, whether we're in a debate or in a conversation. When we talk about suffering in the field of philosophy or religion, or apologetics, we talk about the problem of evil. So could you start by actually telling us what the problem of evil is?
Yeah. So just two very quick acknowledgements before we jump into the definitions. And the two acknowledgements are this. First, this for many of us, suffering isn't an abstract theoretical question. Suffering is a felt reality. And to everyone that's listening, if that's true of you, may I just first say that I'm so deeply sorry for what you're going through. And you could already object and say, Alonso, you have no idea what I'm going through. And you know what? You would be right. I don't. Suffering is complicated and complex. And so I'm not going to try to pretend that I understand what you're going through, because I think that that would be insulting. But can I just encourage you to interpret this podcast as a first step in your thinking and possibly even your healing journey? And if you need help, because we all need help from time to time, please reach out for help. There are so many people that are willing to compassionately listen and love you through whatever you're going through. And then the second little acknowledgement, and then we'll get into the definitions, is this. I want to be sensitive to the fact, the heartbreaking fact, Andreas, that some of us here have not just been hurt by anybody, but have been hurt by Christians, that have been hurt by the church. I remember I was in London a few years ago, and I was giving a talk on suffering, and this 15-year-old guy comes up to me afterwards, and he says, I appreciate your talk. I want to tell you a story. I said, cool, man. And he told me that 5 years ago, his mom was diagnosed with cancer. When he was just 10 years old, he finds this news out. And it was an aggressive cancer, and she passed away very shortly thereafter. And so as a 10-year-old, he's just utterly confused and scared. And so he goes to his local church, and his question for them was very simple. Why? Why would God take my mom? And their response was this, and I quote, because I've just never forgotten it. They said this: the reason your mom died of cancer is because you had more faith in your mom than in God. So let me just not mince words at all. Things like that are spiritual, emotional abuse, and they're wrong, full stop, no excuses. And if you're somebody that's heard such nonsense like that, please hear me, that was wrong. And I am so profoundly sorry that you had an experience like that with Christians or with the church. Okay, that's my two acknowledgements. So problem of evil, let's define some terms here. I think in the philosophy of religion literature, broadly speaking, you're going to break this problem into two major areas. One's going to be natural evil or natural disasters. And then the second one's going to be moral evil. And so let me unpack each of them. So the first one, natural. So this is going to be with respect to nature or natural disasters, viruses, those sorts of things. With moral evil, by contrast, this is between human beings, and there are two problems that challenge theism when the problem of evil is presented. And it's this. Number one is the logical problem of evil. And what that tries to accomplish is that it tries to show that it is logically impossible for God and evil to coexist. And you could say in that evil that, could be synonymous with suffering and injustice and so on. So logically impossible. Number two is the evidential problem. And so the evidential problem tries to show that given the evil in our world, especially the volume of evil and duration, that it is improbable that there is an omnipotent, omnipresent, holy, good God. And so those are the main problems that philosophers of religion and theologians wrestle with when they're thinking about the problem of evil.
Thank you for that remarks you made at the beginning of your answer, Alonso. I think it's something important, often forgetting when trying to answer this kind of questions. Now, there are many arguments against the existence of God. that have been proposed and developed by atheist philosophers. But I think suffering is one of the main objections against the existence of God. I mean, when we go out and talk to people, to lay people, many of them are not involved in the world of philosophy of religion or consume atheist literature, but they reject God because of evil, because the evil and suffering in the world. So why do you think suffering is one of the biggest objection against God? Or I don't know if you think so.
I do. I think most philosophers and theologians think that the problem of suffering is the most formidable objection against the existence of God, especially if you've really gone through it, eh? Like just pausing the intellectual, philosophical side for a moment. You know, my wife and I, we just went through a season of betrayal in our church and in ministry. I used to work for RZIM in Canada as an apologist under Rabbi Zacharias, and that was so deeply wounding. And then we've also had in our personal lives, my wife and I remember in 2 years, we had 12 people pass away, including friends passing away, grandparents. And then the closest one for me was my brother. My brother had passed away in 2019, February 3rd, and he died of a cancer. It started in his colon and metastasized. It spread to his liver and to his lungs and ultimately claimed his life. And so, yeah, man, I totally resonate and feel those folks that this is like a serious, serious problem. And so I think it's right that the philosophers and theologians think that it's one of the most formidable, if not the most, um, against theism. So here's one version of the problem of evil that philosophers will present to theists. And so it'll be something like this. That it is logically impossible for God and suffering to coexist. So this is the logical problem of suffering and evil. So it'll go something like this. It'll have it'll be made up of a syllogism, which is premise one, premise two, therefore conclusion. And so it'll look like this. Number one, if God is all powerful and all loving, then he wouldn't allow evil. Number two, but evil exists. Therefore, number three, God must not exist. And it's really important for everybody to know why they think that this is, like, to understand why behind the problem. And it's this. So number one, since God is all powerful, then he should be powerful enough to stop evil. And number two, since God is all loving, then he should be loving enough to want to stop it. Does that make sense? And so that, I think, is how most people interact with the problem of evil. You even have it in pop culture, eh? It was in the Man of Steel, I think, the Superman movie recently. I don't know, recently, like in the past 10 years. I'm starting to get old and say recently, and it's like a decade. Um, but that's the problem.
Yes, and I've seen that version of the problem of evil all over the internet through memes. On the other hand, I think asking God, why are you allowing this to happen to me, is an honest question that we as a human can ask. Somehow evil touches every human being.
Yes. And I was just, I don't want to get off track here, but it is interesting. I was just doing my devotionals this morning, and I'm trying to read through the Bible in like 6 months, like one of those sort of plans, eh? And I'm in Isaiah right now, and in Isaiah, it says here, I just have it up on my computer, and it says, "This is Yahweh speaking to Israel," and they say, "Do not fear, I have redeemed you. I've summoned you by name, and you are mine. When you pass through the waters, I'll be with you. When you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned, and the flames will not ablaze." So I was just thinking about this morning, Andreas, of like, one of the things that's interesting about the Christian faith, which I appreciate, is that suffering isn't overlooked in the Bible. It is in there, embedded into every book. It's a given that you will encounter suffering in the world. It doesn't try to pitch you this photoshopped, neat picture of humanity and the world, but is brutally honest and real. So I've just always appreciated that about the scriptures. Okay, sorry.
No, that's perfect, brother. Now, in both the Christian worldview and in atheism, suffering is a real thing, right? The point is then which of the two worldviews responds more coherent to evil. And well, quickly, let's look at atheism first. Does atheism respond better to evil and suffering? Well, God cannot exist because of suffering, okay? But what do you say to someone who is suffering, who is actually suffering?
Yeah. So this is an interesting question, Andreas. Uh, my personal view on this is I don't think so. And to be fair, I also think that it doesn't claim to either. But in either way, the more I've suffered personally and thought through what atheism has on offer, my intuition is that I wouldn't want atheism to be true in light of the suffering that I've experienced and the suffering and evil and injustice that the world has experienced. So let me just like unpack that just like a little bit. So first, God not existing doesn't seem to resolve as much as people may hope that it would resolve. And the reason seems to be quite clear, and it's because we're still faced, if God didn't exist, we're still faced with the brutal reality that evil and suffering and injustice exists in our world. And that's a really critical point, I think, to realize. And with all due respect, and I really mean that, I personally think that if atheism is true, then it actually makes suffering worse. So, for example, you've heard of Richard Dawkins, I'm assuming. So, this is an often quoted piece by him where he says about the problem of evil in the world that he says this: in a universe of blind physical forces, at bottom there is no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And so, when we think about that, like no evil, think about the horrors of human trafficking and racism and bullying and terrorism and all of these sorts of things. Deep on the inside, we protest that these sorts of things are absolutely evil, that they're unjust, and that it's not a matter of mere opinion. In England, they have this debate here, which is fascinating as a Canadian to observe. We don't have such debates. Whether you should, on a scone or a scone, you should put cream on or jam on. Have you heard of this, Andreas? No? It's a big thing over here, right? Like the country's divided, like whether you put on cream first or jam first. And so evil, it seems like, it's not like that. Like we don't want to say that human trafficking is merely an opinion, like putting cream on before jam. We want to say that it is like absolutely evil. And furthermore, there is something deep on the inside that rebels against ideas like Susan Blackmore, who's a famous author and public lecturer and so on. And when she was interviewed about the tragedies of our world, she says that, quote, "My response is that nothing matters. It's all empty and meaningless. That's just the way the world is. Get used to it," end quote. And so, if you're thinking about some of the horrendous evil that's occurred in the world, you think about Auschwitz, let's say, in Nazi-occupied Germany. Can you imagine how dehumanizing it is to a survivor of Auschwitz to hear it's all empty and meaningless? Or how devaluing nothing matters would sound to them? Or how decomforting it is when someone is forced to, quote, get used to it, because there is no hope for ultimate justice according to atheism. And so here's my point. Yes, people that have experienced evil, like an Auschwitz survivor, let's say, They have difficult questions for God, no doubt about that. But I think even more difficult questions arise if there is no God. And so, no, I don't think atheism responds better to suffering than theism does. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your answer, Alanzo. Well, as you said, we consider that theism, specifically Christianity, responds better to suffering in the world. Now, let's develop this idea a little bit. There is suffering in the world, and we believe that God exists. So, what would be some reasons why God will allow suffering in the world?
Okay, so this is really interesting, Andreas. I'm so glad that you asked it. So I'm sitting here in Oxford by God's grace. There's no reason this former drug addict should be sitting here. Um, but C.S. Lewis used to live here, and this is where he wrote Chronicles of Narnia and a bunch of other really fantastic books that I wholeheartedly encourage your viewers to read. And he says in one of his books, it's critically important that we examine the assumptions within a question. And assumptions are things that we just assume to be correct or true. And so it's the same thing when we're thinking about the problem of evil. As I laid it out, there are hidden assumptions, which Christian thinkers like Alvin Plantinga, Peter von Inwagen, Richard Swinburne, my favorite Eleanor Stump, and others have illuminated. And so in the philosophy of religion literature, the problem that I presented, the logical problem of evil, is considered a defeated problem. And by that, they mean both atheists and believers in God alike agree that the problem of evil, as I laid it out, isn't as sound of an argument as they once supposed it was. And they defeated it by identifying those hidden assumptions. And so there are lots of hidden assumptions within the problem of evil. But here are just two, just to kind of like get you thinking in that sort of way. And the first one is this. The first hidden assumption is that since God is all powerful, then he can just create any world he wants. Like, for example, a world without evil and suffering and injustice and all those sorts of things. And the Christian response seems to be, well, not necessarily. So love is what makes life worth living. And love is the aim of God's creation. We see that on page 1 of the Bible. And for love to exist, freedom is required. And if we are free, then evil, injustice, suffering are all possibilities. And the Bible's response to why evil, suffering, and injustice exist is because human beings have exercised their free will to go against God or to rebel against God. And so some people will ask or push back and they'll say, well, couldn't God have chosen a world where human beings only freely choose to do good instead of evil? And the answer, the very quick answer, seems to be no, not necessarily. Because, well, what sort of human beings would they be if they could only choose to do good? And it seems that they would be some sort of AI, some sort of heavenly celestial algorithm fueling them, or robots or puppets or something like that, but not truly human. To be truly human, it seems that they need to be free in order to experience and express love, which is God's chief aim, meaningfully. So that's the first assumption. The second assumption is equally important. So the second assumption is that isn't it impossible for an all-loving God to have a moral or good reason for allowing suffering? And the problem with that is that it is an impossible position to defend. So let me unpack it like this. How can one know, in the technical sense of the word know, with like certainty, that God doesn't have a reason for allowing these things to happen? God could have one reason or two reasons or 17,083 reasons or a trillion reasons. And lots of philosophers have presented reasons throughout, especially the past 50 years in the philosophy of religion, literature. Some will say this is a result of the fallen world. Or some will say that not all suffering is bad. Like, Andreas, you look like you go to the gym, on a leg day at the gym. That suffering's there. It's intrinsic to going to the gym and doing leg day, but that's not a bad thing. It has some positive utility to it. Or number three, suffering is difficult, but experiencing it helps develop our character. It has this ability to teach us to be more loving and caring and compassionate and empathetic and forgiving and courageous and all of these sorts of things. You think of people like, you know, Harriet Tubman, for example, or Mother Teresa, William Wilberforce, Goku and Vegeta, if you like Dragon Ball Z, or other anime, those sorts of reasons. And then lastly, there's another reason is something called skeptical theism. And that's an unhelpful sort of phrase. So skeptical theism isn't what it sounds like you're skeptical that God exists or something like that. No, instead, what skeptical theism will try to advance is that there is like this gap in perspective and understanding between God and us, and that we just might not be able to bridge that gap. So you could think of it like Lord of the Rings. I don't know if you watched Lord of the Rings or read the books or watched Rings of Power, which I love all of them. But there's this gap in perspective and understanding of the big picture between, say, Frodo and J.R.R. Tolkien, or between Frodo and the reader. And skeptical theism would say that there's a similar sort of gap between human beings and God. And so God could have reasons, but we might just not be able to understand them or grasp them, given our finite minds and his infinite mind. So just a very quick caveat, and then we can go to the next question, which is, please hear me. I'm not saying that any of those reasons are why someone listening is suffering. I'm not saying that at all. However, what it does mean, these sorts of identifying the hidden assumptions, what it does mean is that it is logically possible for God and evil to coexist at the same time.
Great, great. And these reasons they give are often called theodicies, right?
Yeah. In theology, they use this word called theodicy, and it's attempts to give a rational justification for why God would permit certain evil and suffering and injustice. Yeah.
Well, we can say that these theodicies work together as a cumulative case for trying to answer why there is so much suffering. As Christians, we don't pretend to say, hey, this is the reason why God allows suffering. No. There are many situations that we go through as human beings, and maybe some theodicies respond better than other depending on the context and circumstance that is being experienced. So yes, they work as a cumulative case in a similar way to arguments for the existence of God, perhaps.
And I think it should be said too, Andreas, that I think sometimes our minds want to systematize these things. So we want to have our neat categories and say that this theodicy, this reason, maps on to this particular experience. And I'm just not sure how easily you can do that. It doesn't seem to be that neat. So I would just be cautious against stuff like that. But I agree with you that there is this cumulative sense that it could be a whole group of these theodicies working at once together that it can explain or will explain one day, in glory, the reasons why you went through those particular things that you went through.
Great. Now, someone might say, well, God exists and has reasons for allowing, evil in the world, but why do I have to trust a God who allows suffering? How would you say then to a person who keeps refusing, to trust God because he sees so much evil and suffering in the world?
So I think that this is like the next natural question. So once you do the philosophical work, trust, I think, is my sort of knee jerk sort of reaction to, okay, well, sure, he can coexist with evil, but why? Like, why on earth should I trust him if he does? That sort of thing. And so this is a deep question on multiple levels, metaphysically, existentially, personally. And I find that personally, this becomes less intellectual and more about a question about the heart. And so let me tell you a story. Okay, so I'm in Toronto, hence the hat, Toronto Raptors basketball, NBA. Let's go. And so I'm in Toronto. I worked there for a couple of years with RZAM. And during that time in our office, we hosted this exhibit entitled Beautiful by this American artist named Craig Hawkins. And he had partnered with this Indian humanitarian organization called Agni Raksha. And their partnership was created to raise funds and bring awareness to the horrific practice of bride burning. I don't know how familiar you are with this practice, but in Southern Asia, thousands of women every single year in either some domestic violence, some act of domestic violence, or because of some sort of marriage arrangement, they are burned alive. So the husband either is being violent towards them, or in the marriage situation, they can't afford the dowry, the payment from the bride's family to the groom's family. And so the consequence in some of these families, not all of them, but some of them, is to burn the bride to be. Okay, so some of them just like throw acid on them and it disfigures them. Others will take kerosene, pour it on them, and literally just light them on fire. It's just so heartbreaking. And what makes matters even worse there is that the legal system in some of those countries, so far too often, their perpetrators never face justice. Some of them just pay off the police, and while others just run from the police. And many of the women are too frightened or too poor to really pursue justice. So how can you trust a God that allows that sort of stuff to happen? And so one day I'm in Toronto, we have this exhibit, it's all these paintings on the walls, And this one gentleman comes in, and his name is Naweed. And Naweed, he was a non-Christian guy, comes in, he wants to check out the artwork. Cool. I'm going to walk him around. I'm going to show him the artwork. And after I show him around, we end the tour with my favorite piece, Andreas. It was this photograph. And it's a photograph of a group of these women from the humanitarian organization. They're all burn victims, and they are smiling and together in this photograph. And Naweed, the gentleman, he asked me one of the most profound questions that I've ever heard. It's always stuck with me. He says this, do these women live together? And I was like, oh man, no one's ever asked that. I'm not too sure, but how come? Like, why are you asking? And he says this, I'll never forget this, Andreas. He says this, I suspect that they do because it is only those with scars that could possibly understand the scars of others. Only those with scars that can possibly understand the scars of others. I said to him, Naweed, we come from completely different worldviews, but the beauty and the power of the gospel, the good news, is that at the center of it isn't an unscathed God, but a scarred one. And as I walked away from the exhibit with Naweed, I said, man, you have a great name. What does that name mean? And he says, Naweed is Arabic, and it means good news. I just thought that was so interesting. So listen, even though we might not know every sort of reason for every situation of suffering and evil and injustice, the person of Jesus means that the answer can't be because God doesn't care. He cares deeply, and he cares deeply about your hurt and mine. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son. So if he didn't care, then he wouldn't have come. And he would not have come and become the scarred God. So the Bible's ultimate response and unique response to how can we trust this God that allows evil and suffering in our world, is Emmanuel, God with us. And this is that's a huge point when it comes to the doctrine of incarnation, God enfleshed amongst us in our hurt. And sorry, I'm just going to end with this because I don't want to monologue too long, Andreas, but it's a really, really important question. You got to notice two things, I think, when you're reading the Gospels. One, that Jesus, who's God in the flesh, that's the point of the doctrine of incarnation. When we read the Gospels, we get to see how God responds to evil and suffering and injustice when he's that close in proximity in the flesh. So there's a mom who loses her son. There is a pair of sisters who lose their brother. There are those who've been rejected by society and religion, those possessed by evil, the sick, the violent, the poor, all of these sorts of things. And we get to ask the question, well, how does God respond to those things? And the answer is, he hates it. He assaults things like evil and suffering. And he doesn't run away from it, but runs to it. And he runs to it, like all of those examples that I just enumerated, he runs to it not with, anger and vengeance or something like that, but runs to it with compassion and healing and taking individuals in those circumstances and redirecting them towards the good and towards the just. And he encounters so many of those situations with tears. And so that's point one. And point number two, it's not enough that Jesus just observes suffering in the gospel. That would get me to trust him, but not go all the way. No, when we read the gospels, we see how Jesus himself suffers. And this really garners my trust. We see what it is like. We see that God knows what it's like personally to be a refugee, to be impoverished, to be hungry, to be thirsty, to experience rejection from society and from the religious authorities, to encounter personal evil, to experience psychological and physiological trauma. And think about this, because I would even include sexual trauma here, because they force him to take off his clothes and he is hung naked in front of his creation. He experiences abandonment, an unjust trial. He's tortured and ultimately executed. So I think that when I think about the question of trust, it's the person of Jesus that gets me to trust God, even though God has chosen to allow suffering and evil in this world.
Great. As you rightly mentioned, we can say that Christianity is the only religion that can say that God suffers with us. Jesus is the proof of it.
Yeah. And I guess too, and that's a really good point, Andreas, it's not only, so when you start studying these things, dear listener, it's not that Jesus just suffered. I should have made that point clear. If Jesus only suffered, then Jesus would only be comfort. He wouldn't be a source of hope. And I think hope is what we're really looking for when it comes to suffering. And the reason why Jesus is the hope for Christians around the globe is because of his resurrection. The resurrection means that evil doesn't have the final word. That even if the men who burned those women, let's say, escaped justice now, that they won't escape justice in the end. And that because Jesus lives and was not swallowed up by evil and suffering and injustice, we can be certain that victims of evil will not be either. And in the end, what Jesus really promises to every bleeding heart is that every wrong will be righted and our finite joy will be swamped with infinite. Sorry, I said that incorrectly. Our finite suffering will be swamped with infinite joy. That's the ultimate hope within the Christian worldview.
One of my favorite verses when talking about the problem of suffering is Revelation 21:4. This verse, this verse shows the essence of Christian's hope. God promises to put an end to evil in the world. But I think this verse not only speaks of hope, but it also shows the kind of God we worship. A God who is close and who really cares for his creation, unlike other religions.
Yes. Yes, you don't get this in other worldviews, just as a matter of fact. You don't get this in Buddhism, in Islam, or any other worldview. God coming and becoming scarred in the way that God becomes scarred in the Christian worldview. And that's so, as somebody that's personally suffered a lot, not as much as some people, I find that God having scars and understanding really comforting. That's what I needed during those real dark nights. And he can do the same for you who are listening.
Now, along with the question of suffering, always comes the question of hell. Why will a good God allow people to go to hell?
Yeah, so there's a few different views within theology on hell. And I would encourage your listeners to read and think and explore each of them whilst also reading the scriptures. Because at the end of the day, scripture has to take precedent. It is the supreme authority within the Christian worldview. And so here are the four different views. One is universalism. So this would say that, I don't know, whatever we think about hell now in your imagination, that God in the end will save every single person. And hell would just be for the Satan and his demons. View number two is annihilationism. And that means that souls after death that still do not want to have relationship with God, though God continues to be very open to that relationship with them, will be snuffed out. So there won't be an eternal consciousness for those who reject God. View number three is eternal conscious torture. And this is probably what's coming to mind for most people when they think about hell. So this will be, your Dante's Inferno, or if you watch cartoons and you see a devil in red clothing with a pitchfork, people are literally being tortured for the rest of eternity. You can think of even the movie with Keanu Reeves, Constantine, like that sort of jam. And then number four, the final one, is eternal conscious torment. And this is actually where I think I find myself on the whole spectrum, which is, and it's torment, not torture. That's an important distinction. Torture is external. Torment is internal. And so people like C.S. Lewis write brilliantly on this, like in the Great Divorce, for example, that what hell is a cage that is locked from the inside. And God doesn't want you to go to hell, but God's given you free will. And if you choose during your entire life to take the path that does not lead to God, but to your own autonomy, to your own sort of making an idol out of yourself or something out of this world, that you are taking this path towards away from the presence of God. And so, like, well, what does that mean? Well, it means that you're slowly becoming more wanting to be your own God. You don't want to have a relationship with him. And so if you think about this, Andreas, like, I think this makes a lot of sense, at least how I think, and I'm open to being proven wrong, is that when we're thinking about hell, this is, as C.S. Lewis would say, a monument to human freedom. If you didn't want to go to heaven and be in a relationship with God, the late Christopher Hitchens said that would be hell for him. to be forced into heaven. He just doesn't want to be there. And so it seems like God, like, what is God to do? Well, God has to make some space for people that don't want a relationship with him. And that seems to be what hell is. The space where people who don't want God are relocated. Now, that might sound like I'm trying to soften it a bit. I don't think it's a good place to be. I'll say it for the following reason. With God's presence comes lots of different attributes. So you'll get things like light and joy and pleasure, as the psalmist says, pleasure forevermore. So those things come along with the presence of God. But if you're put into this place because you don't want a relationship with God, and therefore there is no presence of God there, whatever that means, then I think at the very least it means that you don't get those things that come with God. God's a package deal. And so I think you would be inhabiting a space like Jesus says in the scriptures and other New Testament writers when they're talking about hell, is a place that is devoid of light and devoid of joy and devoid of pleasure and all of these sorts of things. Jesus uses a lot of metaphorical language when talking about hell in the New Testament. Fun fact, Jesus talks more about hell than any other person in the Bible. And this is not a place that you want to go. The metaphors are striving to describe a place that is worse than anything that you can imagine. And I think the Bible would say the worst thing that you can imagine is God allowing you to go down the path of the flesh as far as you can go, and then him just saying, okay, you can go all the way, and you just finally succumb to it. It's sort of like this. This is the last thing. If you've seen Lord of the Rings, Gollum he's one of the main characters. You know, there's Gollum, and then there's like Frodo from the Shire. Yeah. And well, actually, it would be Bilbo Baggins. So this is the Hobbit. So in the Hobbit, you have Bilbo Baggins and you have Gollum. They're both this species called Hobbit, these little people. Okay. One, Gollum, comes across this ring of power, and it just corrupts him. He just gives into this thing. And what does that mean? Well, he just indulges nonstop this ring. And this ring has this symbolism of sin and so on. Whereas the hobbits, you know, let's say for argument's sake, they just remain pure. It seems like Gollum indulging himself is the thing that destroys him. And now he's beyond any sort of recognition of being a hobbit. And I think that's similar to hell, is that it's eternal conscious torment is the position I land on. And eventually, if you resist God your entire life and then pass away, God takes away his hand of trying to fight to get you back onto the good path of the true and the good and the beautiful. And you just become that thing like a Gollum that you're just indulging yourself in and your flesh. And it's a miserable, miserable state of affair. And God doesn't want that for you because he deeply, deeply loves you and wants you to be on the path of the good and the true and the beautiful.
Thank you, Alanzo. And
sorry, that's a long answer. I apologize, but it's a complicated question and a really important one.
Yes, we can even have a whole interview talking only about hell and Christianity.
We didn't even talk about like the rich man and Lazarus, and
yeah,
which is another reason why I think eternal conscious torment is likely the right position. But you know, I think all of us pray that, I don't know, universalism is true, that somehow God, you know, can do something like that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Alanzo, to wrap up this interview, what advice would you give to Christians on how to offer a word of encouragement to someone who is suffering?
So I think Jesus does it best. You know, no surprise. In John chapter 11, he encounters two grieving sisters. They just lost their brother. And it's very interesting how God in the flesh, Jesus Christ, responds. And I think we can learn from it when we're chatting with our friends about suffering, and it's this. To one of the sisters, there's the intellectual side. And so Jesus engages in a very high level theological discussion with her about hope, about resurrection, about Jesus's true identity. And that is what that sister needed. She needed that conversation. And some of our friends will need that conversation too. However, there's another sister. And what did she need? She needed Jesus to collapse in the dust with her and just weep. Just be with her. I think some of our friends need that. That we are just present. We're not saying anything, but we are weeping with those who weep. And we can just be a presence to them. And when they're ready to talk, they'll talk. But in the meantime, don't rush that conversation. The best thing that Job's friends did was stay quiet for a week. So that's my advice. And pray for your friends if they've experienced some sort of evil and injustice or suffering currently. Pray for them. God hears prayers and he's close to the brokenhearted.
Great advice, bro. And well, thank you so much for joining me. It's been great talking to you.
Pleasure.
Yeah, the question of suffering is not easy, but it has been a good conversation. I hope you can come back soon to Imago Day. God bless you, brother.
Thank you for having me. Can I just say what you're doing is incredible. God bless you. And everyone that's listening, like, subscribe, give a 5-star review, do whatever it takes to support Andreas because he's an incredible brother.
Thank you so much, Alanzo. And well, goodbye.